Coronary heart disease is the leading killer in the United States, killing over 500,000 people a year and affecting 7 million people total. It is not limited by race, age, socioeconomic status, or sex. Coronary heart disease develops when a combination of fatty materials, calcium, and plaque build up in the arteries that supply the heart and blood. Myocardial infarction, which we'll put as MI, is a medical term for a heart attack. There's no specific cause for coronary heart disease, but some factors contribute to it. Smoking, high blood pressure or cholesterol, physical activity, obesity, diabetes, stress, overconsumption of alcohol are controllable. Age, gender, and race are not. Symptoms include mild chest pain, intermediate chest pain. Sometimes there's no signs at all, and it can be diagnosed with an electrocardiogram or different tests. It is difficult to establish what moderate drinking is because, for one, it might be moderate, but for another, that same level might be legally drunk. Women metabolize alcohol different, and it remains in their system longer. Each study that we look at defines alcohol intake differently, so in order to set a baseline for comparison, we'll set moderate at 1 to 2 drinks 3 to 4 times a week for men, and 1 drink 3 to 4 times for women. Light will be established at a drink or less 1 to 2 times a week, and heavy at 2+ drinks 5 or more times a week. In order to establish baseline for what a drink is, it's a shot, a glass of wine, or a glass of beer. Each study that we define, most studies that we look at will break down the pure alcohol content in order to compare alcoholic intake. Ethanol is the pure alcohol found by multiplying the alcoholic percentage times the volume, and this is expressed in grams. The relative risk factors use a Cox proportional hazard regression model to calculate risk estimates, adjusting for the known risk factors for coronary heart disease: education, smoking, physical activity, body mass index, food intake, among other things. The rationale that I chose this for is that I have a family history of both heart disease and alcohol consumption, and I want to know what my predetermined risk factors are. And my question for the research is, what is the relationship between moderate alcohol consumption and coronary heart disease? The first study that we're looking at, Sophia Malutina et al., looked at a population in Russia. Samples were taken in 1984, 85, 88, and 94. The method they used was a cross-sectional survey that compared rates of CHD and mortality to the general population. The survey used reported frequency of use and amount per occasion for the last year. They followed up with MI and CHD occurrences, a mean of 9.5 years later. Their findings, Malutina set a standard of comparison at the non-drinking category, which is classified as drinkers who don't consume for the survey. It's also for this 160 grams is equivalent to 1/5 of vodka. Non-drinkers had a higher prevalence of CHD than former drinkers. Those who consume less than 40 grams per week had a 0.58% risk factor. 40 to 79 grams per week had a raise factor to 0.76. 80 to 119, 80 to 119 was 0.86, 120 to 159 was 1.13, meaning that it was a higher risk of CHD, and more than 1/5 was equivalent. Looking at the relationship between amount of consumption and mortality from CHD, standard comparisons were set for the light drinkers. Non-drinkers had a higher rate of mortality with the risk factor of 1.47, greater than 80 grams, a risk factor of 1.13, which is more than light drinkers but less than non-drinkers. More than 120 grams in a week had a 1.17, and more than 1/5 a week was 1.27. All of those were higher than light drinkers, but less than non-drinkers. Malutina also looked at the mortality risk compared to the frequency of drinking episodes, regardless of the amount consumed. Standard was set for the occasional drinker. Non-drinkers, by comparison, had a risk factor of 1.83. Rare drinkers had a risk factor of 0.92, and weekly drinkers had a 0.85 risk factor, and frequent drinkers with a risk factor of 1.45. Combining these results, Malutina looked at the risk factor of CHD compared to the frequency and amount consumed. Standard was set at the occasional drinkers. An increase in consumption frequency and amount all led to higher risk for coronary heart disease. Frequent binge drinkings had the highest risk of everyone. Malutina's findings for a study was that occasional binge drinking shows no correlation to CHD risk, but frequent binge drinking or heavy drinking does have an increased mortality. It should be noted that this was done in Russia, so what they consider normal drinking we would put on the high end. Now that we have established what heavy and frequent binge drinking is a high risk, the second study looks to see the relation between drinking patterns. Jane Tolstrup et al. Looked at a Danish population. They were given a food questionnaire that, among other things, measured amount and frequency of alcohol consumption. They had a follow-up of a mean of 5.7 years later and compared to the general Danish population. The relationship between frequency and times per week, men and women compared their risk factor for CHD. Standard was set for occasional drinkers. Women had basically the same risk factors regardless of frequency of drinking during the week. Men saw a drop when frequency was increased. Women's drinking patterns combined amount and frequency standard set the standard at 1 to 6 drinks on one occasion. The best association was more on the amount consumed, not on the frequency. Non-drinkers had higher risk than drinkers, and the best risk factor was for 14 drink category 2 to 4 times per week. The same pattern was combined for men. Drinking 5 to 7 times per week all had basically the same risk factor regardless of consumption. Binge drinking still showed a higher risk of CHD. Tolstrup's finding states that among women, alcohol intake may be primary determinant for inverse association between drinking alcohol and risk of CHD, whereas men, frequency, not intake, was more important. Our next study also looks at pattern, but also the types of alcohol consumed. Mukamel used a population of male health professionals free from CHD at baseline. They filled out a food questionnaire measuring, among other things, frequency and type of alcohol consumed. There's a follow-up every 4 years for 12 years. Drinkers and their CHD rates were compared to non-drinkers. Types of alcohol were also compared. For looking at the amounts, pure alcohol was measured in ethanol in grams. Men had similar risk factors regardless of amount consumed, but a downward trend for frequency of consumption. With regard to type of alcohol consumed, risk factors were compared in regards to amount. Red wine showed no better risk than beer, liquor, or white wine. The differences were negligible. Mukamel's findings, frequency was more important than amount, agreeing with Tolstrup's finds that there was no difference between types of alcohol consumed. Knowing that heavy drinking can raise blood pressure, moderate drinking has proven to an inverse relationship with CHD. Sarah Boss and others looked to find the relationship between drinking patterns in hypertensive women. Boss's population was hypertensive women free from CHD at baseline. They filled out a food frequency questionnaire looking at the amount of alcohol consumed. The mean follow-up was 9.4 years later, and then compared CHD from non-drinkers to drinkers. Standard for the comparison was set on the non-drinkers, and there was an inverse relationship between relative risk amount and amount consumed. This again proves Tolstrup's findings that for women, amount, not frequency, reduces the risk for coronary heart disease. Jolene Boulins asked the same question about hypertensive men. She used hypertensive men free from CHD at baseline. A food frequency questionnaire was filled out in 1986 and every 2 years until 1998 to compare the survey drinkers versus non-drinkers. Boulins looked at the relationship between the ethanol consumed per day and risk of total MI incidents and fatal CHD occurrences. Non-drinkers were set to have the standard for comparison. There's a downward trend for the amount consumed per day in CHD events, and the lowest rates were actually over those who consumed 50 grams or more per day. This is against Tolstrup's findings that there wasn't a strong relationship between amount consumed and CHD risk, but it does agree that there is an inverse relationship for alcohol consumption and CHD. Our last study was done by Jackson, and looked specifically at the question alcohol consumption and the risk of coronary heart disease. 2,300 men in New Zealand were chosen because they had prior MI events. They were given questionnaires asking about alcohol consumption levels prior to the event. In the case of death, next of kin filled out the questionnaire. Standard was set at never drinkers used for this comparison. There was a reduced risk for both heart attack and fatal coronary heart disease for men and women. There was a slight increase for former drinkers for fatal CHD. But in general, there was a downward trend until the binge drinking levels were reached. Jackson's conclusions were that men had nominal changes in regards to amount of consumption until there was heavy drinking, which we then saw an increase. Women saw significant drop for MI and fatal CHD risk factors for light and moderate drinking. Light and moderate drinkers, both men and women, have a decreased risk of CHD occurrence, fatal and non-fatal. So in conclusion, for all cases, occasional heavy and binge drinking had no effect on relative risk for CHD, but frequent heavy drinking saw a rise in the risk. Women's primary determinant of the inverse association between drinking and the risk for CHD was intake, where men's frequency was more important. Both of these were confirmed by Macumel and Box. Light and moderate drinkers, both men and women, have a decreased risk of CHD occurrence, both fatal and non-fatal. Alcohol consumption has a reverse relationship to MI and CHD, and should be noted that while heavy drinking still has a positive direct relationship, that it does increase blood pressure, which indirectly can cause heart attacks. Type of alcohol does not matter. Limitations for this research is that alcohol for these questionnaires were always self-reported, and the studies found we're using EBSCO search engine, Medline with full text here at Trinity Western. For further research, these studies look very little at heavy alcohol consumption and the overall risk of mortality with liver disease. And there does not seem to be conclusive research into the reasons behind the positive effect of alcohol on CHD, so further studies could look into those specifics. So to answer the question, what is the relationship between moderate alcohol consumption and coronary heart disease? Light and moderate alcohol has proven to have a positive effect on coronary heart disease.